Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Rae Smith. Here we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. If you're interested in learning more about AWIP and our mission, make sure that you check us out on either of our websites, awip.org.uk or awipusa.org. And of course, you can always find me and our episodes posted up every single week on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. So, a couple months ago, I got a heads up about this really great book that was coming out about animal rescue. And I was so interested and intrigued by this. I actually pre ordered this book like an entire month ahead of time. And I got to talk to the author of the book about this ahead of time. So, I invited her onto the podcast. So, surprise. My guest today is Carol Mithers. She is the author of the new book, Rethinking Rescue. I cannot say enough great things about it. Carol has written several books of her own. She's appeared in her articles. She's written on animal welfare as well. Has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, LA Weekly, and on and on and on it goes. And it's my understanding she has a background in social justice reporting. So, Carol, thank you very much for being here with me today. I'm so excited to talk about your book. It was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
So it's my understanding that when you thought about writing the book, you had a particular idea in mind. You were interested in writing about, rescue hoarding. And the idea of the book kind of changed as you found more information out about this. What did that look like? What happened?
Well, I actually had just a magazine story or newspaper story in mind on animal hoarding because I read a story in the LA Times and I was just sort of horrified, fascinated with it. I'd never heard of this and I wanted to learn more. So I asked a friend of mine, another Carol, who I had known since junior high and who had been in the rescue world. Have you ever heard of this? She said, yes. And she directed me to Lori Weiss because Lori had just come through dealing with a really horrifying and difficult situation involving hoarding that I then later wrote about. And when I got to know Lori, I thought her story was actually more interesting. I wrote the hoarding story but Lori's adventures and her stories of her work downtown seemed to me to be worthy of a book. And what I had imagined at that point was writing a story about a heroic animal rescuer who saved terrible mistreated animals on the streets of LA's downtown. At the time, I should say, I knew almost nothing about the rescue world. My family and I had adopted a rescue dog in 1999. We fell into it. It was the first rescue group we'd ever contacted. We got another rescue dog from the same organization when the first dog died, but I didn't know anything about the world. And so all I knew was what I think most Americans knew, which is a lot of dogs die in shelters and heroic people rescue them. And these dogs were the victims of terrible suffering. And anybody with a conscience should not buy a dog, should adopt, don't shop.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first inclination with Lori was to follow that same paradigm. And then the more time I spent with her, the more my thinking changed because that's not how she sees things. And she was introducing me to this idea that in addition to taking dogs and cats out of shelters, we need to look beyond into how they got there in the first place. And the story was often much more nuanced and complicated than some horrible person mistreated them and they were saved from a terrible life and now we're going on to something better. And so the whole story became way more complicated. And the more research I did, the more complicated it got. And that's why it took years and years between deciding I was going to write this book and actually doing it, because I found amazing parallels to For instance, what happened to people who were struggling in poverty or through various kinds of dysfunction and their animals. And the same was true of parents and children, and the criminalizing of neglect and income inequality and no kill, which I know we want to talk about later. And it all just became a huge tapestry that was not just about poor suffering animals, but about social justice. And it was at that point that it became much more interesting to me. We have my daughter was doing global not social work, but global relief work for a while, and through her I learned the term social determinants of health. In other words, people don't just get sick because they get sick. There's all kinds of social and cultural factors involved, and it was the same thing was true of animal overpopulation and animal problem population. It wasn't just about one thing. It was about everything.
I will very gradually take us into the no kill talk that we're going to get into as
I
we get
know.
into this. I know that
I
it can
know.
be a little difficult, but Carol, so your friend Carol Pearson, I've
Yes.
chatted with her. She's lovely,
Yes.
by the
Yes,
way,
she is.
very
She is.
intelligent, very dedicated woman.
Yes.
But you said that she helped you kind of understand and navigate the rescue world. Her and some other people you met a lot of people in the animal welfare world.
Right.
Was there anything that shocked you or made you challenge your understanding about rescue operations or sheltering practices while you were doing your research for the book?
I think it drove home to me how incredibly difficult what people did was. I think that I had some fairy tale notion that you went to the shelter, you got an animal, you found a home, and that's how it went. And the the difficulty of finding an animal that particular group felt it could help, that a lot of times the animals turned out to be sick or have other problems, and everybody laughed about the big questionnaires and the interrogations that people in rescue often put would-be adopters through. But it was really, I see why it happened, that there was so much work and money into neutering an animal, and in many cases curing it of mange or infections or wounds, and it was just such a long and difficult process. And then the other thing that really I was useful to me, I went with Carol and I went with a couple of other people when they made their rounds at the shelter and decided which animal to take. And you also see the heartbreak of that, because if you're a rescuer, you do it because you love animals, and you can't take them all unless you're a hoarder, and you have to actually steel yourself. I think it was Carol was the one who said the line that I've never forgot, which is that you can't go to the shelter without deciding what you can do and what you're looking for, because otherwise it's like going to Costco without a list. And
Exactly.
and and the other thing that shocked me, which I had no idea of, which is a less positive thing, which is the grift and the scamming that seems to be really endemic in that world, not by true rescuers, but by hangers on around the edges, because I never would have imagined that this was a site for scamming. And the fact that I can't imagine that, a lot of people can't imagine that. And so that's why it works. And there was just, I spent so many hours on Facebook following feuds and denunciations of various people who were pulling animals and not treating them right, or not pulling them and posting ads saying that they were raising money, or raising money and then disappearing. And I just found that absolutely shocking.
So you're a big portion of your book focuses on Lori Weiss and
Mm-hmm.
her whole story, starting even from when she was a kid growing up. And her whole model is about preventing pets from entering shelters initially by addressing the root causes of
Mm-hmm.
surrender. And so during your research, what would you say are some of the main causes for surrender? And can you elaborate on the economic challenges of pet ownership?
Sure. I mean, one of the biggies is dogs, and I'm going to focus mostly on dogs because cats are. This is where I mostly looked, and cats are kind of a different situation. The feral cat issue is
Sure.
a different issue, but dogs, it's a lot of misbehavior, and I think some of that is because people don't understand how time consuming and how much effort training can take. They get a cute puppy, and then suddenly the puppy grows into a big dog that's still peeing in the house and biting people. And it's not as big an economic issue as some of the other things I'm going to go into, but it's not that easy to get publicly funded or low cost training. And I know my family knows somebody who adopted a big sort of middle-aged lab from a rescue group, and this dog was incredibly reactive and went after everybody who set foot on the property and tried to bite them. And then the issue became, do we give this dog back? Do we risk a lawsuit? Or do we get a trainer? And they got a trainer, a very good, a well-recommended trainer. The man who hired the guy called me and said, like, this was more expensive than me going to therapy. Like, it's really expensive. It worked. It's great. I wish that there were more low-cost training options out there. Like sometimes there's low-cost kids' summer camps in public parks. I wish there was more of that. The other issues are far more complicated, which is one of the big ones is housing. I think there's a lot of anger that I see on the internet at people who surrender animals because they say I'm moving or the landlord won't allow it. But it's actually a really big problem. And this country doesn't have enough affordable housing for anybody.
Yeah.
And if you have an animal, it's 20 times harder. There are landlords who take pets, but there are still more that won't, or they have all kinds of restrictions. And there's a growing tendency to charge extra pet deposits or pet rent.
Mm-hmm.
And these make what is already unaffordable even more unaffordable. I've read some statistics that say, so we have a good 30%, 36% of all households and more of those held by people of color are renters. And many are already rent burdened. They spend 50 to 75% of their income on rent. So you add in $100 a month, $50 a month, it becomes unaffordable. Mm-hmm. And in addition, there are some landlords who are maybe in appreciating neighborhoods who decide that one of the ways they can get tenants to move on if they've been there for a while for more affluent renters is maybe they cast a blind eye on the fact that they have a dog. Well, suddenly they say your lease says no dogs. And you really do have a choice of being evicted, which destroys your credit and your ability to rent later,
yeah,
or giving up the animal. So it's really a hard choice. The other biggie, hugie, is vet fees. And every one of us who owns a pet knows how freaking expensive it is
I could
just to go to the
that.
vet.
Yeah,
It's and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one of the other things that shocked me when I started researching this book was that the corporate consolidation of the veterinary industry and the entrance of private equity into that industry. So at this point, you have large corporations, for instance, Mars, the candy company, they own VCA, Banfield Pet Hospitals, Blue Pearl Specialty Hospitals, 5 major pet food brands, and a diagnostic equipment company. And so you can't say it's coincidental, but in the last decade, vet fees have risen by more than 60%, even more than human healthcare, which we know is no bargain.
Right.
So you have people who are already rent burdened, already kind of on the edge, like most of us. Most of us don't have $400. We know the famous study saying Americans don't have $400 for an emergency. Suddenly, your dog swallows a sock or is hit by a car or something big happens. And when you go to the vet, you have to pay up front. There are sometimes ways that you can set up payment schedules. Some of the credit cards that are available for vet care charge really high interest rates. And so even if you have insurance, you have to pay up front and then file a claim. So you still have to have access to the cash that enables you to do the treatment. So like with housing, you end up with a really impossible choice, which is opt for what the vets call economic euthanasia, which makes them want to kill themselves, or you surrender the animal to the shelter. Sometimes people do that believing that there's a vet there who will take care of it, or some nice person will come along and see their suffering pet and decide to cure it, which is not likely.
Mm-hmm.
Or you go into and take on catastrophic debt. And that's really no choice at all.
Right.
And so all of these things together make it really difficult if you are not affluent to have an animal.
Even before your prologue in your book, you have a quote in there from Tom, I'm going to botch his last name, Tom Junod, who wrote The State of the American Dog.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote that you included is, America is two countries now, the country of its narrative and the country of its numbers. Why did you include that in there?
Because I think that the traditional rescue narrative is the one that made me think of that, is different from the numbers of people involved in losing their dogs, or the number of the dogs and cats that suffer. It's like we tell stories, and those stories leave things out. And I think that the rescue narrative, for a variety of reasons, was crafted by more affluent people. And because we are increasingly a country of different groups that don't interact with each other, and in this case, I'm talking about people of means and people in poverty, we don't understand their reality. And so the stories we tell reflect our reality, not multiple realities. And that's why when I was talking about people feeling condemnatory about people who say, I'm moving and I can't take the animal, and you'll see over and over comments, I would sleep on the street before I would give up my pet. And I read those and I think, did you ever really face that choice? Mm-hmm. And if you had really faced that choice, would you say that so blithely? Mm-hmm. Because it's really bad to sleep on the streets with your dog or in your car. And if you have children, to expose them to that, it's not that simple. I feel like I live a middle-class life, and I try really hard to understand what it would be like to live differently, but I don't think I can. I mean, to be counting every penny, to be living in a crowded place, to have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and still be short of money. We don't have the sympathy for those stories, and we don't even necessarily understand them.
I think what struck hard for me while I was reading your book was that throughout the book, you explore the philosophical undertone of sheltering and the no-kill movement. Mm-hmm. And you pull from different sources to emphasize these points. And so one of them was a quote you put in there from Edward Dubin
Mm-hmm.
in a 1989 essay, In the Name of Mercy. He's revered as the father of the no-kill movement, and the quote was that he had written, "If our movement spent as much time as soberly evaluating our policies and programs as we do our public image, then no doubt the struggle for justice would be on higher ground." So, my question for you, Carol, is do you think that those who adhere to the no kill values can help more people and animals if they reevaluate what really matters instead of focusing on their image and raking in profits and live release numbers?
Yes, and that's a complicated question too. I mean, first of all, the raking the profits, I think that there's only one or two, and maybe just one group that rakes in profits using that slogan,
Yeah.
and I think that slogan was a work of genius when it began, because it really was like it made it clear what the struggle was and what the goal was, and it was very useful that way.
Hmm.
I think we don't even know what it means anymore, quite frankly.
Hmm.
The move from don't kill anything to the current kind of, I guess, mostly generally widely accepted rubric now, which is a 90% live release rate of healthy adoptable animals, is problematic for various reasons,
Hmm.
because there's a lot of ways around it. The fact that you put numbers there means that there's then incentive to play with those numbers. Shelters move animals around. There's the movement with cats, for instance, to do new not trap, neuter, release, but return to field operations, where even sometimes healthy and potentially adoptable cats are simply put back out in the community,
Hmm.
which plays with the numbers, because cats comprise a huge percentage often of shelter euthanasia, because feral cats are not adoptable. So trap, neuter, release for feral cats is, I understand why people do it. Frankly, from my research, it doesn't seem to have ever really worked on a global scale, because
Hmm.
it works in very contained areas, but it's really hard and expensive to make it work globally. Um, and I think that it doesn't take into account the very different realities that different shelters face. Some places have smaller populations and more adoptable populations, and other places, our own South LA shelter here in LA, which is one of the most jammed and the one that mostly I wrote about, is, it's filled with big dogs, and
Hmm.
some of them are outside dogs, and some of them are untrained dogs. And it's like the notion that you can find homes for them is really problematic. And the other way that shelters that are under a great deal of public pressure to meet the no-kill rubric end up they end up categorizing animals as unadoptable. Maybe they push definitions that way. In the worst case scenario, they release dangerous animals or difficult animals to the
Hmm.
public, because it's better to get them out. And I think the other thing that happens is that it categorizes shelters as, you see this term all the time, he's in a kill shelter. And I think that it just makes my skin crawl when I see that, because none of the people that work in shelters want to be killing animals. And just as an aside, the people that work in shelters are themselves kind of low wage workers, and
Hmm.
usually often working class people or people of color. And you're you're attacking them as well. It's like not their choice to do this.
One of the things that you talked about was how different shelters can categorize their live outcomes. Some can say that, if we refer to it as a jammy dog, jumpy and mouthy,
Uh-huh.
or fearful dog, or even if someone just gave the dog away or it escaped, they certain dogs can be arguably, listed as behavioral
Right,
euthanasia
right,
because they're
right, right.
jammy or they're fearful, and that doesn't play into their statistics of however they feel like counting whatever the
Absolutely.
live outcome is. Was that surprising to you to figure out like all the different ways, all these different, like there's no one standard that they're operating on?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think it was like a very useful organizing tool when it began, and then we have a much more sophisticated understanding now. And going back to the reasons that people surrender is that the idea of no kill also does not take into consideration the larger economic context. And the other thing that's true now is that the advocates of no kill have been telling us now since like 2000 that no kill nation is just around the corner, and the latest is now 2025. Well, we're at 2025 and we're not even close to no kill, and I think you risk having people say this is all just bullshit because
Yep.
you keep promising it and it's not happening, and it doesn't take into account the the ways in which social conditions affect pet outcomes. In 2000, nobody wanted to be killing dogs in 2008 either. But you had people losing their homes, and guess what? The shelters flooded. It doesn't. It's way too simplistic. It was a good rallying cry and starting point, but we can be much more sophisticated about what we can do now. Because the other answer is what are we going to do if we say everything should be no kill and yet the animals keep coming in? I saw something recently from a large organization who you can guess at, saying that the secret is that if Americans would only adopt 6% of the dogs that we are now buying, the shelters would be empty. I remember seeing this argument made in 2007
Mm-hmm.
by another no-kill advocate. And here's the thing. Yes, that's true. If they weren't coming in, it's
Yeah.
like you're going to empty the shelters. That assumes no more inflow. And that's never been the case, and it's certainly not the case now. So that was partly why Lori's argument that if you're going to empty something, you have to stop the inflow. And
Yeah.
it's wise for anyone who doesn't want to kill animals, but it's also wise for the people, because people who surrender animals, yes, there are some jerks who just dump animals,
Yep.
but there are a lot of people who grieve and don't want to do it and would be good pet owners if they had a little help. And
Mhm.
that's where you help stop the inflow.
Well, I think what's frustrating for me being in the animal welfare space is that when no kill started, there was this gigantic emphasis on adopting and fostering. We just need more to adopt. We
Right,
just need more
right.
fosters. And we talked about, you brought this up, that these open admission shelters became so vilified. We became so vilified at what we were doing. But there was a pushback a few years ago where open admission shelters developed this alternative um, method called socially conscious sheltering,
Yes, yes.
which was geared at stopping intake before they hit the door. And it originated in Colorado. It's been very, very prominent here. It's spread all over the country. It's actually spread to other countries who have taken up that model. Um, so I'm wondering, Carol, like while you're doing this research, do you think that as you looked at these trends, as you looked at these different models, and the challenges that open admission shelters are facing based on their population they serve, their geographical area, whatever resources were available to them, do you feel like you got better insight as to what those challenges are, uh, like from an outside perspective?
Yes, and I think that what you're talking about, the socially conscious movement, it's funny, I had not, I saw a, a bunch of stuff about it a couple of years ago and then have not recently, but I know that there has been an effort that has become much more widespread of helping pet owners as a way of pet retention.
Hmm.
Lori called it intervention. Retention is another word.
Hmm.
Pet food pantries and other ways to help pet owners who are struggling. And there's also been an increasing amount of pushback on the whole no kill as the reigning paradigm. That I've seen stuff that you've written, stuff that other people have written, and I think there's a greater understanding that this was a limited, it's not even a tactic, it's a slogan. And
Hmm.
so even some of the tactics that have been involved with it from the past about increased adoption and understanding that was never going to be enough.
Hmm.
And so I think the idea I think there's going to be another push within the city of LA to embrace intervention. And what was really amazing about Lori was I think she was the first one who really made it explicit that this was something that was not only important but totally doable.
Yep.
That the fees she was spending on keeping pets out of the shelter were minute compared to what it costs to house an animal, especially if you're under pressure not to euthanize. You could be keeping animals for a year, 2 years, at very injurious to their health and
Hmm.
expensive, and that it's far more economically sane and much more humane to keep an animal in its original home if what it takes is a little bit of help rather than impound it and put it in a cage and then try to figure out what to do with it. So I think there is greater understanding of that now.
And Lori, you talked to her, and you got quotes from her when there was a section in your book you talked about redemption porn,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that chapter. But you talked about how with redemption porn, there's no it's a very effective tactic at gaining support and people viewing what you're doing, but there's no call to action, and it doesn't address the root problem of the overpopulation and intake and such at its origins. And you would ask Lori about this, and she just said, we can't get people to invest on the front end. It's not
Yeah,
dramatic or exciting. And
yeah.
um this is exemplified in the book because she talks about, like, even though you said this is very possible, it's very difficult to get other people on board with this and look at this from a macro perspective of preventing the intake before it happens. So do you think that managed intake, and by managed intake I mean preventing turning people away from the shelter, telling them, we're full, we don't have room, you need to go somewhere else, we can't help you. Does that distract from the real solution to the problem, which is also, spay neuter? Do you think that creates actually this perpetual financial funding loop for organizations who don't want to stop the intakes at its source and really, really focus on spay neuter efforts?
I think I'm not sure I'd say that organizations don't want to stop the intake. I think
Mhm.
that it's a question of how you stop it, and do you emphasize stopping it versus emptying the shelter. Um, I think managed intake is a real problem. I have heard bad stories about people being turned away. There were people being turned away in LA during COVID because the shelters weren't open. And a lot of times what you end up with is animals left on the street or in the rain or on the property, boxes of kittens and puppies. And a public shelter is supposed to be a place of last resort for people
Mhm.
that cannot keep or handle an animal, or where animals that are found on the street that either can have better homes or are too dangerous to be left on the street. That's like saying, somebody can commit crimes and we're just going to return them to field. It's like, that's not how things should work.
Yeah.
I think that there's not enough emphasis on spay and neuter. That especially during COVID, some of the statistics I read those were another shocking thing, that there were so many spay and neuter operations that could not function during COVID because either vets couldn't be in enclosed spaces together or protective equipment was funneled to people. And so you have this blitz of kittens and puppies that were born, which is far more in the last couple of years than was true earlier. And people couldn't afford it, couldn't access it. And it is a source of amazement to me that there are not organizations throwing as much money as they have at spay and making spay and neuter, vans going through the city, vans parking on corners, mobile vans at shopping centers.
Mhm.
The other thing was I had this really interesting talk with a woman named Lisa Milot, I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, at University of Georgia, who is one of the few people who has written about backyard breeding,
Mhm.
which is a big problem in pet overpopulation because there are
Yeah.
people who do it, try to make some extra money for it. And it's really, really hard to stop because people don't, in LA, you're required to have a license if you breed your dog. But if you don't get the license, who knows you're out there. Um, and so I was saying, in terms of stopping backyard breeders, she said the first step is always making spay and neuter accessible to people who want it.
Mhm.
Because once you get rid of what she called the inadvertent breeders, the breeders on purpose become much more visible because they're suddenly the source of the puppies and kittens that are coming
Yeah.
out. So I've asked this of all of my rescue friends. It's like, why are we not spending vast amounts of money to cut down on the litters? And nobody has given me an answer to this question so far. So,
Well, there's a theory in animal welfare that some of the major organizations who can have a significant impact on spay neuter efforts because of the vast amount of wealth they have are not interested in pushing that so much, because if you continue to have this overpopulation issue and you have animals that are continuing to enter in the shelter, and you have this loop, you have this faucet that never gets turned off,
mm-hmm,
that they're able to, at that point in time, continue to push their campaigns in
yeah,
that financial loop that had asked about. And so you have this one method that is shelter prevention, and then you have this other method that is shelter emptying. And I know
right,
you've talked about that on another podcast before.
yeah,
I did an interview with Dr. Jeff Young a few weeks ago, and he had talked about he's a major spay neuter fanatic veterinarian, and he had said that if you were not spending more money in the community on preventative measures, then you're not doing something right. And you had talked about in your book too, for with Peter Marsh from New Hampshire,
mm-hmm, right,
and that he had done these studies with these publicly funded sterilization programs in New Hampshire, reduced intake statewide, and as a result of reduced intake because of these mass pet sterilization programs, that the euthanasia numbers
Yeah.
overall dropped 75% in about a 10-year time frame.
Well, I think you can just look at the history of the United States, which is the 70s, when right before widespread spay and neuter became popular and accepted, we were euthanizing a lot more, 23 million animals, I think, a year. And once we had these campaigns to popularize spay and neuter in the 70s, Bob Barker and other people saying, do it, the rates dropped dramatically. They were still too high. There were still multiple millions, but it was maybe a third or quarter of what it had been. So it seems, and I think the other thing that is different now is you have a lot of populations in the U.S. who come from countries where spay and neuter was not as widespread, accepted or known as it is here. So educate people. You know, we were not educated once. There's in a sense, I think, a lot of scorn for people who don't, quote, know better. But, you know, we didn't know better not that long ago.
Yeah.
So make those campaigns, reach out to people where they are. And I think when you were talking about the funding of organizations, when Lori was talking about it's not sexy, it's like it's really hard to show the lack of something. You know, you can see a very cute kitten born, but you can't see a kitten not born.
Right.
And the other issue, I think, is that a lot of these problems are associated with low-income communities, and we don't like to help low-income communities. We're talking, you know, America has very mixed feelings about helping those who need help, especially when they don't look like us.
Right.
And it's really not helpful.
And Lori was just this force of nature that you described in the book, and she was just fearless. I mean, there were several times you said she went into areas where she probably shouldn't have been, but just because she was just so driven on helping people, and I say was, but she still is active and still doing these things, but because she knew that the problems essentially ended up boiling down to several different things, you know, lack of education. Like you said, people didn't know there were a resource, didn't know, you know, the benefits of spay, neuter, vaccinating, all that, but that they didn't have access to these things. And I'm wondering, do you think that more governments should subsidize not just spay, neuter, but other preventative measures?
I think government subsidy is a problem, and I think that given the current political climate, it's highly unlikely to ever happen, since we don't want to help people anymore. But
Sure.
But you know, Lori is with funding that she can get. She just opened her own veterinary hospital in a low-income, underserved area, and so that kind of work could be done, and it could be done with available animal welfare money. I wish a couple of things would happen. I mean, we know that America needs affordable housing. That would help. And that's, you know, government does to some extent fund that, and we still don't have enough. But and we have more pet food pantries and things like that going on. But one of the things that I wish we would have is that I wish that programs that are subsidized, for instance, LA Animal Services has a low-cost spay and neuter voucher program. It's not utilized that much. It's not utilized as much as it could be. Why? Because sometimes accessing those spay and neuter vouchers require computer literacy and signing up for forms online, and you have populations that maybe aren't quite as online as you and I. And the other issue is they require you going to certain vets, and not all vets take what the spay and neuter vouchers offer, and they don't give enough money so that they will cover the procedure but not, for instance, the cone that your animal might need afterwards, or pain medication. So there is more expense involved, and maybe that expense is just enough to push people over the top and not be able to afford the procedure. Somebody I know who is a longtime shelter volunteer voiced this idea to me, and I just think it's so brilliant, which is, we don't have enough vets, and why don't we have programs subsidized by I don't know who, where vets who go and get their education and make a commitment, like Teach for America, to work in underserved communities for a year, 2 years, get their tuition debt waived.
Yeah, I love that.
I love that idea. I think it's totally brilliant. But it's like, those are the kind of things I just can't imagine. Maybe state governments, maybe city governments will subsidize some things, but I think it's very hard when there are so many human needs right now and problems like homelessness throughout the country. I think it's would be hard.
Yeah. Well, Carol, before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave our viewers with, a message, or is there anything that you want to discuss before we end?
I think I wish people who love animals would have understanding and love for people as well, and understand that what we were talking about earlier, that the problem of pets in shelters, Lori says it's not a people problem or a pet problem, it's a poverty problem. It's everything, people end up in jail. Sometimes they're bad people, but sometimes it's because of the way in which they had to grow up, and that it's all interconnected, and you can't just look at it and as one sad-eyed dog in a shelter, and if I take it out or give money to some rescue group, it's going to solve the problem. We have to look at it in a bigger, more global way.
Carol, thank you so much for coming on. I think this was a great discussion, and it emphasized so many different areas that were in your books. I appreciate all of your time.
Thank you for the chance to talk about it.
And for all of our viewers or anyone who's listening, again, Carol Mithers, her book is Rethinking Rescue. It's fantastic. You can find it anywhere you get your books, Barnes & Noble, Target, Amazon. I know I pre-ordered mine on Amazon. So thank you to everybody for tuning into the AWIP podcast. And just remember, spay is the way.